2 days of arguments are now complete surrounding government funding for non-Catholic students in Catholic schools. For some insight into how this could affect those not even named in the appeal, I'm joined by Brian Hillis. Brian teaches religious studies at the University of Regina and also is the president of Luther College Regina. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
What was your take on the appeal this week?
I didn't get a chance to watch the entirety of the appeal. I've only seen some highlights. And I'm not a lawyer and I don't know the legal process well enough. The highlights that I saw didn't address what I thought was the principal argument of the judge regarding religious neutrality, and that seemed odd to me. We heard a lot of talk about taxes and where they might be directed and matters of choice, which can be a religious neutrality question. But as I say, I can't really comment too much because I didn't get a chance to watch the whole of the appeals.
As president of Luther College Regina, how does Luther get its funding?
We get our funding in part from the government. For every student that attends Luther College, we get 70% of the average grant that goes to other students attending other schools in the province. And that's why there's this controversy in Theodore, because there is attachment to every student of money that goes with that student. We only get 70% of that. Other schools in the province that are associate schools, like the Huda School in Regina here, for instance, Regina Christian, they get 80%. That's something that we are working with our government because we think that we should be at 80% also, and it's actually an historical mistake that we aren't. And then schools like us tend to typically charge tuition fees in addition to that, as Luther does, as Huda and Regina Christian all charge tuition fees in order to top up the amount that they are not getting from the government.
Speaking of money, the CBC conducted a survey looking at how people in Saskatchewan felt about government funding for Catholic education. What is your thought on that funding question that is becoming a little more controversial?
Well, obviously I'm a bit biased being the president of Luther College Regina, but we with the other historical independent schools and I think many other independent schools in the province would argue that religious neutrality shouldn't mean necessarily religious nothingness. And that's part of the thing that I'm a little worried about this judgment, is it seems to me that the judge is taking the stance, and I have to admit the courts tend to be more increasingly taking the stance, that if we're going to have religious neutrality, the government is not involved in the support or the care of religion and cultural norms generally. And that's not typically been the case in Canada. That's sort of an American model, this separation of church and state, as they call it in the States. We tend to think in terms of religious neutrality, but religious neutrality doesn't mean that religious organizations as a whole aren't supported. So the Huda School does get 80% of its funding from the government. Regina Christian does. Luther gets 70. So it seems to me if students meet the basic requirements of the government as it relates to education and curriculum and professional standards and so on, that religious neutrality could also talk about extending funding to all the schools in perhaps a lesser amount if that's what's needed. I would argue that's not necessarily fair, but you know, we're willing to live with that in order to have our independence to do things a little bit differently in terms of academic standards, community building, and sizes of classes, and so on.
All right, well, it is a very complex subject, so thank you so much for taking the time to break this all down for us today.
Okay, you're welcome.